The year was 1945, and the Pacific theater of World War II had reached a harrowing crescendo. A relentless storm had swept across the small island outpost, turning the muddy trenches into a churning river of debris and despair. Rain fell in heavy, stinging sheets, mixing with the sweat and exhaustion of those who had endured years of relentless hardship. Among the chaos, a group of Japanese female prisoners of war trudged wearily along the muddy paths, their uniforms sodden and clinging to their shivering bodies. Every step was a monumental effort, their faces pale, lips cracked, and eyes hollow from weeks of hunger and fear. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, mingled with the acrid tang of gunpowder from the distant battlefield. Thunder roared above, echoing like the distant cries of a world consumed by conflict. And then, in that unforgiving deluge, it happened, one by one. The women collapsed, unable to bear the weight of their own fatigue. Their bodies crumpled into the mud, helpless and exposed. From the storm emerged figures of determination and resolve, U.S. Marines, battered but unyielding, moving swiftly through the downpour. With quiet urgency, they lifted the collapsing prisoners from the mud, supporting them under trembling arms. Each woman's eyes flickered with confusion, relief, and disbelief, a mixture of terror and gratitude that cut through the storm's roar. The Marines' movements were methodical, almost ceremonial, as though lifting not just bodies, but fragments of shattered spirits. The scene was at once horrifying and poignant, the clash of war's brutality with a flicker of humanity amid the chaos. In that instant, under the tempest, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Marines pressed forward, their boots sinking into the thick, sucking mud as the storm tore at their faces with relentless fury. Each step was a battle against nature itself, the rain pummeling their bodies like tiny shards of glass, the wind clawing at their uniformed shoulders, and the mud threatening to swallow them whole with every faltering footfall. Above, the sky had darkened to a brooding grey, clouds swirling as if mirroring the chaos below. Lightning tore across the heavens, illuminating the battlefield in jagged, fleeting bursts of white light, only to plunge it back into an almost impenetrable darkness. And yet, despite the merciless storm, the Marines moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on the fragile figures ahead. The Japanese female prisoners who'd been forced to endure unimaginable suffering long before the tempest arrived. The women were barely recognizable beneath the layers of mud and rain-soaked fabric. Their uniforms clung to their bodies in tattered, sodden shrouds, each seam weighed down with the relentless moisture. Their hair, matted and plastered against their cheeks, obscured faces once full of youth and life, now etched with lines of fatigue and despair. They moved with a mechanical stiffness, as if their limbs no longer belonged to them, each step a monumental effort. Some staggered, swaying in the torrential downpour, their small hands reaching out instinctively for any form of support. When the mud claimed them entirely, dragging them down to the wet ground, the cries that escaped were muffled by the roar of the storm. Fragile sounds of surrender in a world that had offered little kindness. The Marines worked silently, moving with a rhythm born of necessity. Each man positioned himself with a careful balance, scanning for solid ground beneath the treacherous muck, ensuring that neither rescuer nor rescued would be consumed by the quagmire. With firm yet gentle hands, they lifted the first prisoner, her weight deceptively heavy not just in body, but in the exhaustion etched into every motion. She clung weakly, arms barely wrapping around the soldier's neck, as though even the simplest act of holding on demanded more strength than she could muster. Her eyes were wide with disbelief, a mix of terror and something else, relief faint but unmistakable, flickering in their depths like a candle struggling against a storm wind. Every woman lifted was a portrait of fragility in a world gone mad. The Marines navigated through fallen branches and jagged debris, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if acknowledging the gravity of each life they bore. The scene was surreal, soldiers in sodden uniforms, carrying prisoners whose strength had been stripped to nearly nothing, all framed against a backdrop of violence wrought by both man and nature. Mud splashed up with each step, painting a grimy canvas on the Marines' boots and the women's torn clothing. The storm's ceaseless rhythm punctuated the silence between human breaths, the deafening combination of thunder and rain creating a cocoon of sensory overload, isolating each act of rescue into a tiny, miraculous moment of human connection. Some prisoners were so weak that even the most experienced Marines had to pause, supporting them under the arms while gouging the safest way forward. One woman, in particular, clung to life with a desperate intensity. Her body was frail, shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion, and yet there was a stubborn spark in her eyes, a flicker of awareness, a whisper of gratitude that could barely pierce the storm's roar. The Marine carrying her adjusted his grip, making sure her weight was evenly distributed, mindful that any misstep could send both of them tumbling into the muddy abyss. Around them, the wind howled like a living entity, tearing at anything left unfastened, yet in the midst of that chaos, a strange rhythm emerged, the steady heartbeat of human endurance, the pulse of survival threading through the storm. Every so often, a flash of lightning revealed the scene in startling clarity. Faces streaked with mud and rain, eyes glinting with raw emotion, limbs trembling under the weight of exhaustion. It was a vision both horrifying and profoundly human. The women's expressions shifted constantly, fear at the uncertainty of each step, disbelief at the mercy they had scarcely dared to hope for, and a tentative relief that seemed to blossom despite the storm. The Marines' faces, equally wary, reflected the gravity of the task. Their eyes were trained and focused, yet soft with empathy, the lines of command softened by the realization that these were lives, not mere numbers in the logistics of war. Every careful step, every measured lift, was a testament to a humanity that persisted even amidst destruction. Time seemed to stretch and compress with the storm. Each second was an eternity of effort, each lift an act of monumental significance. Rainwater ran in rivulets down the Marines' necks, mingling with mud, sweat, and the unmistakable salt of fatigue. Yet they pressed forward, their movements choreographed by both experience and instinct. The women, though trembling and broken, responded in kind, finding in the arms of these strangers a fleeting, fragile safety. Each rescue was a miniature victory over both nature and the cruelty that had brought them here, a small triumph of human compassion in a world otherwise defined by chaos and violence. At one particularly perilous point, the Marines had to navigate a narrow stretch of mud between fallen logs and jagged rocks. The prisoners' arms clung to them with a desperation that could not be overstated, fingers digging into fabric for fear of losing the tenuous connection to solid ground. One misstep could have sent both soldier and prisoner into a heap of mud and debris, yet each Marine moved with unwavering precision, muscles coiled and ready to compensate for the unpredictable terrain. The storm raged, yet inside that small corridor of rescue, A sense of purpose and resolve transcended fear. Each lifted woman became not just a survivor of war, but a symbol of the fragile, enduring human spirit. As the Marines pressed onward, their path illuminated sporadically by lightning flashes, a strange juxtaposition of horror and beauty emerged. The women's hair plastered to their faces, mud streaking their features, eyes wide with the raw emotion of survival. It was a scene that captured the essence of human vulnerability and resilience. The soldiers' movements, precise and deliberate, framed the drama in a cinematic way, each lift, each careful step, a frame in a tableau that would remain etched into memory long after the storm had passed. It was more than a rescue. It was a statement that even amidst the fury of nature and the horrors of war, there remained an enduring thread of compassion, of recognition of the intrinsic value of life. And finally, as the Marines continued their slow, methodical advance, the women began to cling not only to their rescuers, but to the faintest hope that survival might be possible. Their breaths, shallow but steady, mingled with the rhythm of rain and thunder, creating a symphony of endurance. The storm showed no sign of relenting, yet within this maelstrom, a fragile narrative of mercy unfolded. Each lifted prisoner, each careful step forward, became a testament to resilience, to the intersection of strength and fragility, to the possibility of humanity persisting even in the darkest and wettest corners of the world. As the storm intensified, the rain became almost horizontal, driven by gusts of wind that tore across the battered landscape with a violence that seemed to challenge every living being. The Japanese female prisoners, already weakened by days, weeks, and even months of hunger, exhaustion, and fear, trembled uncontrollably under the relentless onslaught of the elements. Their clothing, once functional, now clung to their bodies like a second skin, soaked through and weighed down by the accumulated water. Each breath was a labor, each step an act of sheer determination. Some of them could no longer even lift their feet properly, their bodies failing under the weight of fatigue. Their lips were pale and cracked, eyes wide with disbelief, as though the storm itself were an extension of the relentless suffering that had been imposed upon them for so long. The mud squelched beneath them, seeping into their shoes, sliding up their legs, coating them in a thick, clinging layer of earth that made every movement a struggle. The Marines moved with unwavering resolve, their training, experience, and sheer determination guiding them through the treacherous terrain. Every step had to be calculated, every movement precise, as they navigated fallen trees, jagged rocks, and the treacherous quagmire that threatened to claim them with every passing moment. Some prisoners could not stand on their own. Their legs buckled under the combined weight of exhaustion and mud. In response, the Marines bent low, lifting them onto their shoulders with a careful, deliberate grace, cradling them as if each woman were precious cargo, too fragile for the harshness of the world around them. There was a rhythm to their movement, a careful choreography dictated by necessity and guided by instinct. Each lift, each adjustment of a trembling arm, was an acknowledgement of the weight of responsibility resting on their shoulders, not just physically, but morally, emotionally, and spiritually. The prisoners clung to the Marines with a desperation born of both terror and relief. Fingers dug into wet fabric, hands wrapped tightly around arms, and heads rested against strong, supportive shoulders. The storm's ferocity seemed to recede for a moment in these small, human interactions, replaced by a fragile sense of safety, however temporary. The Marines, their faces hardened by the realities of war, showed flashes of tenderness, adjusting a coat to protect a shivering arm, whispering a brief word of reassurance, guiding a trembling hand. It was a surreal scene, the clash of nature's fury with human compassion, the juxtaposition of fragility and strength, vulnerability and protection. In that moment, war's boundaries blurred, and the fundamental humanity of all involved, captor and captive alike, became the only certainty amidst chaos. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. In these intermittent bursts, the intensity of the scene was laid bare. Mud-streaked faces, wide eyes filled with fear, exhaustion and faint hope, rain-soaked uniforms clinging to shivering forms, arms wrapped around shoulders in a precarious but determined embrace. Each flash revealed the rawness of the moment, freezing it in stark clarity before the shadows reclaimed the scene. The Marines' movements were precise, even elegant, as they balanced their own footing against the precarious terrain while ensuring that no prisoner was dropped or left behind. Even the most exhausted women, whose bodies quivered with cold and weakness, found in the security of those arms a lifeline that tethered them to survival. The storm was unrelenting, yet the Marines pressed on, step by careful step, each lift of a prisoner an act of both courage and compassion. The women's breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, sometimes punctuated by murmurs of disbelief or whispered expressions of gratitude that were almost lost to the roar of wind and rain. The Marines adapted instinctively, shifting weight, adjusting grips, and navigating obstacles that would have stopped a less experienced or less determined rescuer. Some women had gone without food or proper rest for days, their bodies hollowed and weakened, yet in those brief lifts, in the firm but gentle hold of a soldier, they experienced something closer to hope than they had in months. Even as the storm threatened to overwhelm them, these fleeting moments of human connection offered a flicker of warmth, a reminder that survival could coexist with mercy. There were moments when the wind struck with such force that the Marines had to brace themselves, their legs spread, hands gripping tightly to prevent themselves and their burdens from slipping into the mud. Yet, in those same moments, the prisoners instinctively tightened their hold, wrapping fingers around arms and shoulders, burying faces against wet cloth, instinctively seeking contact, seeking reassurance, seeking the fragile safety that seemed impossibly far from the horrors of war surrounding them. The scene was almost hypnotic in its rhythms. Lift, adjust, step, brace, repeat. It was a relentless cadence dictated by the storm, by the landscape, and by the unspoken pact between rescuer and rescued. As the group moved forward, the world seemed to shrink to a tunnel of survival, mud, rain, wind, and the interlocking forms of Marines and prisoners navigating each step with painstaking care. The chaos of the storm faded into the background, replaced by the immediacy of breath, balance, and trust. Each woman's trembling body communicated more than words ever could. Every careful movement of a Marine reflected more than technique. It was a declaration that even in war, compassion had a place, that life, no matter how battered, deserved protection. In the rhythm of lifting and moving, the storm became less of a threat and more of a stage on which the endurance of the human spirit was displayed. Thunder rolled overhead, a reminder of the world's ongoing fury, yet the small acts of heroism below carried their own thunder. Fingers dug into fabric, arms wrapped tighter in instinctive solidarity, shoulders bore weight not only physically but emotionally. The prisoners, though fragile, found fleeting moments of courage in the arms that carried them, their spirits buoyed by the unspoken assurance that, at least for now, they were not alone. Even amid the relentless rain and the gnawing cold, the persistence of hope, however faint, illuminated the scene as vividly as any lightning bolt. The Marines' focus never wavered, even as fatigue threatened to pull at their own bodies. Each step required careful thought. Each movement demanded precision, yet they did not falter. Their task was clear, their responsibility absolute, to ensure that each fragile life in their care reached the relative safety that lay just beyond the storm. The women, in turn, responded instinctively, clinging to this support as if it were their last tether to life. There was no time for speeches, no room for hesitation. The storm allowed only action, only movement, only the relentless insistence that they would not fail. In that storm-lashed, mud-choked landscape, the tableau of human endurance unfolded in stark relief. The women's faces, streaked with mud and rain, reflected every possible emotion: fear, exhaustion, awe, disbelief, and the fragile spark of gratitude. The Marines' own faces were a study in resilience and empathy, their every motion calculated to protect, support, and lift. Together in the unrelenting tempest, they created a scene of quiet heroism, a narrative of survival etched in mud, rain, and the fleeting yet indelible connection between human beings at their most vulnerable and their most capable. Even as the wind howled and the rain beat down, there was a strange beauty in the chaos, a cinematic tableau of human fragility and strength intertwined. The prisoners' trembling forms, the careful, deliberate steps of the Marines, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the scene in stark, almost surreal relief, all combined to create a vision that was at once horrifying and profoundly human. Each lift, each adjustment, each step forward was a testament to endurance, courage, and the unbreakable thread of compassion that could persist even in the darkest, wettest hours of war. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of battling mud, wind, and the relentless downpour, the Marines reached a small, sheltered area, hastily constructed with the limited resources available on the battered island. The structure was crude, a framework of wooden beams and tarpaulin, stretched taut to provide at least minimal protection from the storm. Yet to the weary prisoners, it was nothing short of salvation. As the group entered the shelter, the sound of the rain pounding against the roof became less oppressive, muted by the barrier that separated them, even momentarily, from the fury outside. The air within was thick with the mingling scents of wet uniforms, mud, and the faint warmth of human presence. Each woman was set down carefully, one by one, on makeshift platforms that had been arranged to hold them off the ground, offering a fragile barrier between their fragile bodies and the cold, sodden floor. Their exhaustion was immediate and palpable. The women collapsed onto the platforms, their bodies folding into themselves, shivering uncontrollably from the cold, damp, and fatigue that had been building for days. Some moaned softly, half from relief, half from the sudden awareness of how weak and broken they had become. The Marines moved among them, assessing each face, checking for injuries, and quietly wiping away the mud that streaked across cheeks and hair. Their hands were steady, practiced yet gentle, moving with a precision that spoke not only of military training, but of a profound respect for the fragile lives in their care. There was no ceremony, no words of fanfare, just a careful attentiveness that allowed each woman to rest as safely as possible, to find for the first time in days a small measure of comfort. The storm outside continued to rage, a ceaseless reminder of the world's relentless cruelty. Yet inside the shelter, there was a fragile warmth, not just from bodies pressed close together, but from the unspoken recognition of shared humanity. The women's eyes, so wide and haunted when they first fell into the marine's arms, now flickered with the faintest hints of hope and relief. They did not speak much. Words seemed almost too heavy for their exhausted bodies. Instead, small gestures took on monumental significance. A hand pressed to a trembling shoulder, a faint nod of acknowledgement, the careful adjustment of wet clothing to ward off hypothermia. Every movement was a quiet act of care, a testament to the power of compassion in a world dominated by conflict and suffering. The Marines themselves were no strangers to fatigue, yet they moved with the same deliberation and care, understanding that their duty had shifted from combat to preservation. Each glance they offered, each touch, conveyed reassurance: you are safe, for now. The prisoners responded instinctively, some curling into fatal positions, some closing their eyes, and others simply sitting with heads bowed, letting their bodies relax under the weight of someone else's protection. The storm continued to lash the island, the rain slapping against the tarpaulin with relentless fury, yet in that moment, a fragile sanctuary had been created. A pause in time where survival, compassion, and quiet resilience converged. The silence within the shelter was profound, interrupted only by the occasional shiver, the rasp of a breath, or the soft word of a Marine instructing another to adjust a blanket or shift a platform. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the struggles and small triumphs happening beneath its roof. But inside, there was a fragile equilibrium, a temporary reprieve from the chaos. The women's shivering gradually slowed, their labored breaths growing steadier as warmth began to return, faintly but perceptibly. The physical safety offered by the shelter, combined with the gentle care of the Marines, provided an emotional balm, a sense that perhaps the world, though cruel, had not abandoned them entirely. Some prisoners slowly lifted their heads, looking around at others in the shelter. Comrades, fellow sufferers who shared in the same ordeal, and in that exchange, a quiet solidarity emerged. Even in silence, the shared understanding of suffering and survival connected them, forming an invisible bond strengthened by the ordeal they had endured together. The Marines, observing without intrusion, allowed this moment to exist, knowing that emotional recovery, like physical, required patience and care. The storm outside was a reminder of fragility, but it also emphasized the triumph in reaching this space of safety, however temporary, a small victory carved from mud, rain, and human endurance. As the hours passed, the storm's intensity did not abate, but within the shelter, a rhythm developed. The Marines adjusted the platforms, shared what limited resources they could, and monitored each woman carefully. Small comforts, like offering water or gently adjusting clothing, took on monumental significance in the lives of these weakened prisoners. Every gesture, though minor in action, carried profound emotional weight, signaling that someone had recognized their humanity, their suffering, and their right to exist without fear in that moment. The storm, once a symbol of overwhelming chaos and brutality, became a backdrop against which human compassion could shine, highlighting resilience even in the darkest, wettest circumstances. Time became both elastic and irrelevant. Minutes stretched and blurred together as the women rested, their minds slowly processing the sudden shift from danger to temporary safety. The Marines continued their quiet vigilance, moving among the platforms to check on those most vulnerable, adjusting blankets, drying mud-caked clothing, and speaking in low, calm tones when necessary. It was a scene defined by small, deliberate acts, each one reinforcing the fragile thread of survival and dignity that had been preserved against impossible odds. Even as the storm's fury continued unabated, the shelter had become a microcosm of hope, a place where compassion and care had a tangible, immediate impact. Eventually, some of the women began to whisper to one another, sharing fragments of words, the barest attempt to communicate after days of near silence and isolation. These whispers, hesitant and fragile, were punctuated by shivers and sighs, but they represented a fundamental shift, a move from purely physical survival to the tentative beginnings of emotional recovery. The Marines allowed these moments to unfold naturally, their presence quiet and unobtrusive, providing a protective barrier against the external chaos while allowing the women to reclaim, in small increments, a sense of agency over their own bodies and experiences. Each whisper, each slight gesture, became a thread weaving together the tenuous fabric of trust and hope that had been so precariously held in the storm outside. By the time the storm showed faint signs of weakening, a slight easing of the wind, a lessening of the torrential rain, the shelter had transformed from a temporary refuge into a symbol of endurance. The women, though still weak, had begun to recover small measures of energy, their breaths more even, their movements less tentative. The Marines, exhausted themselves, could finally take stock of the lives they had preserved, recognizing the monumental nature of what had been achieved. Each lifted woman had survived not only the physical torment of the storm, but the emotional toll of weeks of suffering, and in doing so, a narrative of human resilience had been written across mud, streaked faces, trembling hands, and the shared warmth of the shelter. Even as night descended and the world outside remained wild and unrelenting, a sense of fragile calm settled within the shelter. The women's eyes, now more focused and less haunted, reflected relief, gratitude, and an inkling of trust. The Marines, ever vigilant, continued their quiet monitoring, aware that survival required constant care and attention. In this suspended moment, the chaos of war was held at bay, if only temporarily, by human compassion, steadfastness, and the unyielding drive to preserve life. The storm, though still raging beyond the walls, became a distant menace, softened by the sanctuary created through deliberate care and the courage to act with unwavering resolve. This moment, fleeting as it was, captured the essence of endurance, the human capacity to persist, to protect, and to reclaim fragments of hope even in the direst circumstances. The shelter, the makeshift platforms, the careful attentiveness of the Marines, and the fragile, yet growing sense of security among the prisoners combined to create a tableau both heart-wrenching and profoundly human. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within these walls, humanity had carved out a small victory, a sanctuary born from compassion, courage, and an unspoken understanding of the value of life, no matter how battered or broken.